So our last speaker for today is Mitchell Allen, and Mitch is officially listed as a research associate of the Archaeological Research Facility, and also I think even of the Smithsonian now too. The ARF is at the University of California, Berkeley. And so he has an active research life about which we will hear some information today from him. But also, many of us know him not only as a former graduate student here at UCLA, but as the publisher of archaeological books par excellence in the last, I would say, 25, 30 years, through his founding of Altamira Press and then of Left Coast Press, which is now part of Routledge and the former, I think, of Rowan and Littlefield. So two publishing efforts that have had a very substantial impact in our field. And I have to guess that probably, Mitch, the publications, the books that you have published through these presses that you've been involved with that have your fingerprint on them, probably would form a pile larger than all of us put together. And your capacity to think broadly, certainly I know has been encouraged by Liz, who oversaw your dissertation on the Philistine landscape, so on the coast of Israel. And here we have you going much further afield, giving us a sense of the breadth of your imagination and attention through your work in Afghanistan. So I'm delighted that you are with us here today, and take it away, Mitch.
Thank you, Liz. There's 30 boxes, well, there we go, in our garage, which is the collection of books that were published by Left Coast Press. They're sitting there waiting for finding of the right library to donate them to. So if anyone's interested in 30 boxes of archaeology books, please let me know. I'd be happy to. My wife actually would be even happier than I am to have them removed from our garage. Long before I met Liz Carter, somewhere back in the prehistoric 1970s, I was engaged in a field project in southwest Afghanistan, a decade-long survey and excavation project in the Sistan region. I was a freshly scrubbed first-year graduate student at the University of Michigan and spent 6 months in the Afghan deserts, helping the project identify almost 200 archaeological sites from the Bronze Age to the present. I got home, dropped out of Michigan, found a job in publishing, and a few years later I went back part-time to the UCLA Archaeology program to get a PhD with Liz. So 45 years after my last visit to Afghanistan, when I retired from publishing 5 years ago, I went back to the PI of this project, Bill Trousdale from the Smithsonian, and asked him if I could help him finish writing up the project, which is otherwise unpublished. Well, certainly the enforced confinement of the last 6 months at home has helped me make great progress on this volume. But also, like some of you in the last few months, I took this time and began weeding through all the stuff that was in all those filing cabinets in the garage that have been sitting untouched for decades. Well, that's when I found my notes from Liz's seminars, including one on ancient storage. She orchestrated this class sometime back in the 1980s and invited her grad students to think about how, where, and why people stored things in the past. I'd already taken many of Liz's classes and seminars, but storage? It wasn't something I had thought much about until we had drilled into the examples that she gave us each week. So this particular request for an abstract for the celebration for Liz today came at the perfect juncture. I had just finished flipping through all my notes from the storage class and the other classes I had taken with her, and I had just finished writing up the description of a bunch of sites concerning storage yards that I'll discuss in a moment. But before that, my knowledge of storage methods from Liz's seminar were instantly useful in 1986 when I started my dissertation project on the Assyrian administration in the southern Levant in the 8th and 7th century BC. Didn't find much stuff around Ashkelon having to do with that topic, but I did find a huge wine production and storage industry dating to the 4th to 6th centuries CE, about 1,000 years later. I became an expert on Gaza jars there on your left, the container of choice for fermenting, storing, and transporting wine from the Holy Land throughout the later Roman Empire. And they were produced in great quantities in the little kilns in my little study area. I still dream, or maybe nightmare, about Gaza jars today. But the PhD got stalled, as many of them do, between the usual grad student sloth and the fact that I had a day job as a book publisher. After 10 years of excuses, 10 years, yes, 10 years of excuses, Liz got frustrated at the lack of progress and sent me what might have been the most professionally useful email that I've ever received in my life. Well, I took a leave from my job, temporary leave, and wrote my dissertation, but not in 10 weeks. I did it in 9. Leave it to Liz to solve a thorny problem. So here I am back, being an archaeologist again, long after completing the dissertation, after a 40-year publishing career, and eons after the storage seminar. And once again, I am confronted with storage, the jars of Sistan. Sistan region is the southwest corner of Afghanistan and the adjacent parts of Iran and Pakistan. It's been documented historically since the 6th century BC and is known archaeologically since the beginning of the Bronze Age. The Helmand-Sistan Project, of which I was a part, was in the field in Afghanistan between 1971 and 1979, co-sponsored by the Smithsonian and the Institute of Archaeology of Afghanistan, directed by Smithsonian anthropologist Bill Trousdale. Though some work had been done previously, ours was the first long-term region-wide survey and excavation project, encompassing some 40,000 square kilometers. Our survey identified some 200 sites, and we excavated at a dozen of them. We left the field with the Soviet invasion in 1979, but had hopes of returning, and that has held off getting the final project report completed until now. The Helmand River, which runs through the middle of Sistan, is the largest river in Afghanistan, running east-west from the Hindu Kush mountains and emptying into the Hamun Lakes, which is on the border with Iran. In Sistan, the Helmand Valley is narrow, maybe 3 or 4 kilometers wide. To the east of it in Sistan is what's called the Sar-o-Tar Plain, roughly translated as a place of emptiness and desolation. A waterless area of over 1,000 square kilometers, now largely covered with sand dunes and racked by strong northern winds that deflate the landscape and everything in it. All that red stuff you see there, that's all pottery that's been sandblasted into little specks. This area was occupied sporadically from about the 12th century BCE and finally abandoned in the 15th century CE. Habitation is only possible there through the construction and maintenance of large canal systems, and you can see how large this particular one is. But when they are in place, such as in the Parthian and Sasanian periods of the first few centuries CE, the population was dense and the farming intense. Of the 150 sites we found in Sar-o-Tar, a dozen of them were noted from a single visible feature, a cluster, as you see in the lower right there, a cluster of large storage jars embedded in the ground. The jars were clearly indicators of some kind of agricultural feature on the landscape. Because of their quantity, usually between 2 or 10 of them together, our assumption is that they were designed for storage of some sort. No other structures were located nearby, so our best guess is that they were the storage facilities for farmhouses adjacent to them that were made of perishable materials and that had become fully eroded away. Here's a map showing the various jar sites that we found, and they were generally located in areas with the smaller canals, and were fairly densely covered with pottery, further indicating that we were near the houses of some agricultural farmsteads. Now that our antennae were in tune, we found jar sites literally everywhere. The jars themselves were universally of a hard-fired, moderately coarse red ware with bulbous bodies and whole-mouth rims. They varied in width, height, and volume. This particular one, from a site called Jars 249, was the only one we fully excavated. It stands slightly over 1 meter high, has a deep sump at its base, and the broken lid was found inside of it. Other ceramics surrounding these sites tended to be consistent and part of a corpus of domestic pottery, including ring-burnished small bowls, pedestal cups, and small jars that span the Parthian and Sasanian eras from the 1st to 5th centuries. Further evidence these jars were part of some kind of domestic agricultural setting. But there was more. Not all these jars were located by themselves. Several were accompanied by ceramic kilns, which held dense scatters of pottery dating to the Parthian Sasanian period as well. In some cases, there were worked stones or baked brick objects on the surface. We call them pulleys, although we really don't know what these things were used for. Several of the sherds had identifying marks, both located on the ceramics or on the ground nearby. And we believe these were designations of ownership of these jars. In addition to the collections of jars by themselves out in the landscape, we also found some of them adjacent to the larger archaeological sites that we documented. Jars 139 and jars 238 in the foreground here, for example, was less than a kilometer away from Kala 231 that was occupied both in Parthian and Sasanian times, and possibly as early as the 10th century BCE. At house 139, which I excavated myself for 3 weeks, we found a half a dozen of these jars just outside the northeast corner of the building. You can see that in the picture in the lower right. But likely the site was used far beyond the 1st century BCE. A subsequent excavation, not in Sar-o-Tar, but along the Helmand River in a site called Sayak, produced a Greek-style temple from Parthian times, an occupational compound around it, and other structures, including a storage area called Storage Area B. In Area B, there were 2 or 3 strata worth of storage jars, many of them the same as styles of the ones we found in Sar-o-Tar. Like Sayak, the site was dated by ceramics, carbon-14, and in fact an inscription that we found in the well to the 1st century BC, extending as far as the 3rd century CE. One of the jars was had reused one of the baked brick columns from the peristyle of the temple as its lid. The dates of these sites, these 2 particular sites, would argue for dating these jars to the Parthian period, and we do. But it's likely they also continued in use in the Sasanian period as well, based upon the number of them that were found in proximity with squared fortified houses that we called kalas, built on a standard template, like the one here at Kala 344. We found over 30 of these kalas in Sar-o-Tar, and a number of them had jars located around them. Some of these jars were decorated a bit differently than the ones at the jar sites, as you can see in the lower left. Not only were they found outside of these large kalas, in some cases they were found inside as well, like here in Kala 359, where they were located in the northwest corner of the site. In our time in Sar-o-Tar, which lasted for 36 weeks, these jars were so common that we got tired of them. And I found in Bill Trousdale's field notebook, jars are becoming so common and such a dominant feature of the Parthian period sites that we stopped specifically recording their occurrences and locating them for mapping. They're everywhere in the Sar-o-Tar area. So in fact, the number of jar sites we have is far more than the ones I showed on the map there. Jars everywhere, which left me thinking, what would Liz do with this? Well, I've already discussed the possible dates and distribution of these features based upon the sites which they were found, but are we correct in assuming that these are associated with now invisible farmhouses? For that, as we did in Liz's seminar on ancient storage, we looked to ethnographic parallels. And fortunately, the Afghan government archaeologists assigned to our project in the 1970s, Ghulam Rahman Amiri, conducted a detailed ethnographic study of these villages, the villages we worked near. Amiri's work was translated into English, the Helmand Baluch, and is now in production, being published later this year in another month or 2. Based upon Amiri's work with the contemporary villages, we might have some idea what the farmhouses looked like at that time. Built of tamarisk branches bound together, creating a frame, and then covered with woven mats. In the winter, the walls and the roofs were covered with mud, a mud coating for heat. From Amiri's discussion with these villagers, these houses can be built in a single day and torn down even more quickly in a matter of hours, leaving only a scatter of trash as the occupants moved into a different part of the area, which happened often because their lives were controlled, at least in modern times, by the modern village Khans, who controlled who controlled their lives and controlled where they did their farming. Did these same farmers of 2,000 years ago have tamarisk trees to use and build their houses from? Well, this particular tree is growing outside of a Ghaznavid house in now waterless Sar-o-Tar, making it probably 1,000 years old. And you can see how the ground level around it has eroded away by the winds. We found numerous other live tamarisk trees in the Sar-o-Tar area, although the region has been waterless for 500 years and unoccupied for an equal amount of time. The Hans themselves, the village chiefs, and probably the leaders and the elite class of the Parthian and Sasanian periods, didn't live in these kinds of houses. They lived in houses made of mud brick, very much like the house of Haji Nafiz Khan, whom he resided in 1975. And the colors that we find in this region probably represent the same kind of occupation of the elite. Amelie pointed to the feudal nature of the system, both modern one and also the ancient one, where farmers were permanently beholden to the village Hans and required to hand over most of their crops to the Hans, as well as perform corvée labor, such as building these houses and such as keeping the canals dug and open. Sorry about that, the dog. At harvest time, the local farmers were required to bring their crops to a central location for distribution under the watchful eyes of the Han. Portions of the farmer's share go to local craftsmen, go to religious and political leaders, go to the mill, which also is owned by the Han, and a large portion goes to the Han himself. The farmer is left with a paltry 50 mon of unthreshed wheat or barley, which is about 225 kilograms. Using one of those wonderful conversion programs available on the web, that comes out to about 300 liters of wheat, or slightly more than that of barley. The jars we measured contain between 80 and 340 liters apiece. Thus, 1 to 4 jars would hold an entire contemporary harvest for an entire year, designed to feed the whole family for the year. And we'd expect that the area, seemingly more productive than today, the harvests were probably slightly larger than they are today. And so a collection of jars between 2 and 10 of them is something that is just the right size for a harvest of the kind of grains that are being harvested today, and to the best of our knowledge were harvested in ancient times. Not only that, these large lidded jars would serve better for the harvest than the pits in the ground that I showed you, which is what's used today by Baluch farmers, which of course produce poor farmers and fat mice. Of course, this does not eliminate the possibility that these were used for water storage. We have traced canals near these jar sites and moats around some of these kalas, so that we know that there's lots of standing water nearby. Still, there'd be ample reason for a family farm to store some of the water at home. And the base of that one jar that we excavated does have a sump at the bottom. Perhaps these jars might have been used for both purposes, or possibly for some other product. We're still not quite sure. If this were 2 decades ago, I would have sent this draft of a paper off to Liz and asked her what she thought of it. She'd suggest looking at half a dozen site reports that I'd never heard of, and she'd ask me some questions that, after she asked them, were so obvious that they would leave me squirming. I'm pretty sure that every former student of Liz's has that same voice in their heads and that sinking feeling in their stomach that Liz would see something immediately that they did not. And just when they decided they should consider insurance as a career, or maybe publishing, rather than archaeology, she would then confirm that you'd really done a good enough job and you shouldn't really be kicked out of the club after all. And that in fact, this was a worthwhile contribution to the field. And then of course, she suggests a couple more places that you might be able to consider publishing it once you've done a major rethinking and of course, a major rewrite. So here we are, 1/4 century later after finishing my dissertation, wondering once again what Liz thinks of my paper and hoping that she'll decide this is a contribution to the field. I'm sure she'll let me know, after she gives me a bunch of good suggestions for improvement and references from her encyclopedic knowledge. So Liz, thank you again for all your support, for your knowledge, for your understanding over so many years. And one more time, I await in trepidation your thoughts on my paper. No project takes place without the the assistance of many, many people. In addition to Liz, here are a few of the many others who I have to thank for all this work. Anyway, thank you all.